But I want to talk to you guys because it's Friday the 13th. I want to do a little fun exercise of looking at the worst Diamondbacks front office decisions during the Mike Hazen era. I believe I have, what is this? 6 decisions written down here. And we're just going to go through these because I don't necessarily have these ranked in order. This is not a power ranking. This is just a discussion of the worst decisions under the Mike Hazen era because it's Friday the 13th. I feel like we should get a little negative, talk about the nightmare scenarios that the D-backs have had to gone through the last few seasons. And I'm only talking about decisions Mike Hayes in the front office have made during the offseason. So we're not talking about trading away Starling Marte at the trade deadline for Caleb Smith or anything like that. We're just specifically talking about off-season decisions that greatly affected this Diamondbacks team. And the first decision that I want to talk about that I was appalled that the D-backs weren't able to get a deal done is letting JD Martinez walk in free agency because JD Martinez, we know what he did when he was acquired by the D-backs. He was one of the main reasons that we were able to be lifted into the postseason. The combination of him and Paul Goldschmidt in that lineup, absolutely nasty. I mean, JD Martinez, 29 home runs in 62 games is insane, but we also can't forget he had a 302 average during that time, 1107 OPS. JD Martinez had a 741 slugging percentage with the D-backs in those 62 games. He absolutely lit the world on fire, but how did the D-backs repay JD Martinez after a playoff berth, a wild card victory over the Colorado Rockies, and just a fantastic season? That was a lot of fun to watch. One of the most historic seasons in D-backs franchise history. How did they repay JD Martinez once we got to the offseason? By letting him sign with the Boston Red Sox. And it wasn't like JD Martinez was trying to leave the woe is me small market Arizona Diamondbacks. No, JD Martinez would have been happy staying in Arizona. His agent, Scott Boras, said he set up multiple meetings with Ken Kendrick trying to convince them to just give them a few more years because the average annual salary wasn't an issue. The D-backs reportedly maybe offered around 2 years, $50 million, and they just wanted a little bit more long-term security. And when you think about what the Boston Red Sox gave JD Martinez, it wasn't like they gave him some crazy deal. They actually gave him a lower average annual value than the 25 million a year he would have gotten from the D-backs. The Red Sox gave him 22 a year over a 5-year period, a 5-year, $110 million deal. And when you consider the numbers that JD Martinez put up in Boston, that is a bargain. JD Martinez, that first year in Boston, this was his slash line. 330 average, 402 OBP, a 629 slugging, 43 home runs, led the league in RBIs, led the league in total bases, and finished fourth in MVP voting. That guy could have been in Arizona with Paul Goldschmidt. But the big hesitancy as to why they didn't re-sign JD Martinez is because they didn't want to give him a deal longer than the contract length of a Paul Goldschmidt who was due up in 2 seasons. So they were like, we need to make sure our books are low for the long term so we can make sure we have the money to pay Paul Goldschmidt when his deal is up. And guess what? They let JD Martinez walk and they still didn't pay Paul Goldschmidt. So you end up letting a premier talent of JD Martinez walk in free agency for nothing. And look, I get it. At the time, there was no DH. So you would have had like basically a poor man's Yasmani Tomas in the outfield, or maybe a rich man's Yasmani Tomas, because JD Martinez is a better defensive outfielder than Yasmani Tomas. So maybe he would have been the rich man's Yasmani Tomas in the outfield because it would have been below average defense. It would have been mediocre defense, but you would have got more than just a 30 home run season like you got from a Yasmani Tomas. You would have got a potential MVP candidate, at least from an offensive standpoint, in your lineup. And then by the time that contract is finished, he would have been a DH for you because the National League, by the time that contract ended when he was with the Boston Red Sox, the National League has implemented the universal DH. So you would have had JD Martinez as your DH at the back end of the deal. And he was such a premier offensive talent. Imagine if you still had that Ketel Marte breakout season with the JD Martinez and those couple years of Paul Goldschmidt, you would have had a real offensive lineup that was stacked and deep, and the David Peralta, like the D-backs could have had one of the most fearsome lineups in baseball with Marte, Goldschmidt, Peralta, and Martinez, but instead they let Martinez walk to the Boston Red Sox for not a very expensive contract at all. Very upset. That is the first big mistake that I want to talk about today. The next big mistake and terrible decision by this front offense during the Mike Hazen era is, let's just get out the way now, the Paul Goldschmidt trade, because they talked about, like, when we go back to this JD Martinez deal, they were talking about like how they want to keep Paul Goldschmidt and they were going to pay him, but apparently the money was just too much for the Arizona Diamondbacks, because 5 years for 130 million for Paul Goldschmidt is apparently just too much for the D-backs, too much for a guy that was your franchise icon, too much for a guy that spent what, close to a guy that spent 8 years in Arizona. That guy was too much. Arguably the best offensive player that has ever donned the Sedona red. Like, you could easily say Luis Gonzalez, but Paul Goldschmidt is easily on the Mount Rushmore of D-backs. He finished second in MVP voting twice, another third place finish. And when you look at his career since leaving for St. Louis, that first year was good, but not great. But every year since that first season, since 2019, Paul Goldschmidt has gotten better every single season. He literally in 2019 finished 20th in MVP voting, 2020 finished 15th in MVP voting, 6th in 2021, and then of course took home the award in 2022. And it's like, that was the fourth year of his contract. He's about to enter the fifth year. Is he going to get even better as an MVP? Like, you were concerned about maybe giving him a 5-year deal because he was entering his 30s and maybe you thought he was going to slow down a little bit. Like, he's literally getting better as the contract is starting to age, and you are paying still for the best years of Paul Goldschmidt, age 30 to 35. Those are still prime years of a major leaguer and an athlete. And the D-backs were like, nah, we would rather trade him and save that money and try to retool this thing a little bit more. Like, it doesn't make sense. And you look at the haul that you got back. I mean, some people would say when you traded Paul Goldschmidt in that scenario, it was a salary dump, so you weren't going to get back the best compensation back in the package. But for at least one season, it felt good. Luke Weaver, Carson Kelly, Andrew Young. But now we know Carson Kelly, I mean, the D-backs just traded for a new catcher this past offseason. So Carson Kelly now is an asset. He might start the season as the starting catcher, but he won't probably finish the season as a starting catcher. Might be a backup catcher by the second half of the season if he's still on the D-backs, if the D-backs haven't traded him at the deadline. And then Luke Weaver, I just saw today, he just re-signed with the Cincinnati Reds, or just signed with the Cincinnati Reds. Like, Luke Weaver is not a very good pitcher. He wasn't good since 2019 either. Both of those guys kind of peaked in 2019. And Paul Goldschmidt, his worst season was 2019, and since then has gotten better. Meanwhile, Luke Weaver and Carson Kelly has looked worse every single season since 2019. So that's the second big mistake that I want to talk about today. The third big mistake that I want to talk about during this Mike Hazen era is the Madison Bumgarner contract, because this D-backs team would be so much better, so much more exciting, and have a higher ceiling if they didn't have Madison Bumgarner on this roster, because Madison Bumgarner, you could probably attribute 8 to 10 losses the last couple seasons just due to poor performance by Madison Bumgarner. Because when you look at the D-backs this past season, right, they were like a fringe wild card contender. Sully Baseball always makes fun of me because I like to talk about how the D-backs at one point during the month of September were in third place in the NL West and looked like they potentially could make the wild card. And the D-backs won 74 games, but could that have been a 80, 81, 82 win season if Madison Bumgarner wasn't in your starting rotation? Madison Bumgarner has looked like arguably the worst starting pitcher in baseball, and he has a real case for calling him the worst starting pitcher in baseball during his tenure with the D-backs, because that first season in Arizona was just absolutely atrocious. A 6.48 ERA, but of course it was the 2020 pandemic shortened season, so you could say, hey, small sample size, weird off season, got cut short. Let's give him the full off season and see what we can do in 2021. Well, guess what? 2021, slightly better results, a 4.67 ERA. I believe his fastball went back up a little bit in 2021 compared to 2020, but still terrible across the board. And then in 2022, you're like, okay, the Madison Bumgarner experiment hasn't worked out through his first 2 years, but now we have Brent Strom, the best pitching coach in baseball. This guy has turned He's turned pumpkins into whatever the Cinderella references that I'm trying to make there. Okay. He's turned pumpkins into beautiful chariots or whatever. He's turned ugly princesses into beautiful princesses. And he could not do that with Madison Bumgarner because he was still the ugly stepchild of the D backs rotation, a 4.88 ERA in 2022. And it felt like the D backs were doing their very best, not put too much on Madison Bumgarner's plate. It felt like if he got through 4 innings of 2 earned runs or less, you were very happy with that. And then you would pull him from the game because you didn't want him to go that 5th inning. You definitely didn't want him to go 3 turns through a lineup. And the fact that the D-backs gave him a 5-year, $85 million deal. The D-backs were coming off an 85-win season. They felt like Madison Bumgarner was going to be the missing piece. And I got to admit, I didn't think it was a bad deal at the time. I was like $15 million a year for a guy who is a World Series champion, a proven veteran, a proven starter in this league. Yeah, he's definitely in the decline. You could see that with his numbers that last year in San Fran, but you still felt like he was a workhorse. And you felt like he was going, and you still felt like he was going to at least be a damn near pretty good number 2 starter. Excuse me. He still felt like he was going to be a pretty good number 2 starter, if not like a low end one. Like, I probably didn't think he was a true number 1 anymore, but I was like, okay, Zach Gallen is really your pseudo number 1, and then Madison Bumgarner is your number 2. I was like, all right, that's probably a pretty damn good frontline rotation. And Madison Bumgarner just hasn't been able to live up to expectations, hasn't been able to live up to the salary. And now he's like an anchor holding back this rotation, a rotation that we just want to let all the young guys loose with the Ryan Nelsons, the Dre Jamesons, the Brandon Fats of the world. But seems like Madison Bumgarner is at least going to take up one of those rotation spots, and it's just very disappointing to see. And this D-backs team would be so much more exciting if Madison Bumgarner would just not on the roster. How about this decision? This one is not a big of a deal as probably the other decisions that I've already discussed, but this one still irks me a little bit, and it's non-tendering Taijuan Walker because I kind of get why they did it. Taijuan Walker was basically coming off a major surgery, hadn't really pitched for the D-backs the last couple of years. He had like 15 innings pitch between 2018 and 2019, so the D-backs non-tendered his contract, let him walk in free agency. But when you do that, when you let someone go that was still that young, Taijuan Walker was only 26 years old. You leave room to be burned, and that's kind of what's happened to the D-backs because after he left, he went back to the Mariners and looked pretty damn good with the Seattle Mariners. And then we know what he did with the New York Mets his first season. He was named an All-Star because of his fantastic first half, a terrible second half, but looked really good in the first half of the season. And then last year looked like a pretty good number 3 level starter as well. And when you think about the decision, like it would have only costed the D-backs around $5 million to bring a Taijuan Walker back. And when you think about the projected rotation without a Taijuan Walker going into the next season, it was Robbie Ray, who we did know at the time, but now we know now with hindsight, he wasn't that far away from falling off a major cliff with this D-backs organization. You had Mike Leake as a potential starter. Like, he's a nobody. Merrill Kelly at the time was still a big question mark. We love Merrill Kelly now, but at the time, if it was Taijuan Walker versus Merrill Kelly, it's kind of surprising that they chose Merrill Kelly. Zach Gallen, of course, that was an easy decision to make. Luke Weaver at the time still had a lot of stability within the organization and a lot of trust, and they were going to give him every opportunity to start. And then Alex Young was another projected guy in that rotation. So it's like outside of Zach Gallen and Luke Weaver, like Taijuan Walker and Robbie Ray, I guess. Taijuan Walker definitely should have been in the mix for the number 4, number 5 spot in the rotation with Merrill Kelly and a Mike Leake and a Alex Young. But instead, they let him walk over $5 million for a guy that was only 26 years old at the time. An absolutely insane decision. This next one is basically a cluster of decisions, and this is going to be the last one that we discuss today. We're not going to hit the 6th one. I really don't think it's that big of a deal, so because we're already running late on time, I'm just going to keep that one in my back pocket. But the 5th decision that really irks me from this Mike Hazen era, and all this is not even Mike Hazen's fault. A lot of this is actually on Ken Kendrick, the owner, but I want to just keep it during the Mike Hazen era. And the last decision that irks me is basically every reliever that has been signed during the pandemic under Mike Hazen, the Ian Kennedys of the world, the Oliver Perez's of the world, the Mark Melancon of the world, the Joaquin Sorias of the world, the Chris Davinsky's, the Tyler Clippards, all those guys were absolutely terrible. Literally none of them helped the D-backs bullpen. It's been tough for the D-backs bullpen to be consistent, be trustworthy. If the D-backs have had a league average bullpen in the last couple of years and no massive Bumgarner, I guarantee you this team is at least a wild card contender. But because the bullpen has been so bad, especially when it comes to closing games, the D-backs in the ninth inning have not been able to close a game. It feels like since Fernando Rodney was in his peak, at least since like Archie Bradley at the very least, who is still a free agent, I mind you. So that's the last decision. D-backs front office has been terrible at picking relievers since the pandemic, and hopefully the 2022 offseason changes some things. But the last 2 to 3 years of D-backs picking up relievers has been an awful experiment.